somewhere inside Microsoft's own headquarters, on a network protected by the same security systems that guard the company's most valuable secrets. There are thousands of laptops quietly breaking the one rule everyone assumed was unbreakable. They don't run Windows, and Microsoft not only knows about it, they built the system that lets it happen. Let that sink in for a second. The company whose name is literally the word Windows, spelled a different way. The company that once had a CEO stand on stage and call Linux a cancer. A company built for 4 decades on the idea that Windows was the one true foundation of computing, is right now, in 2026, handing its own engineers laptops running Ubuntu Linux as official, sanctioned, fully managed company equipment. This isn't a leak. Nobody smuggled this information out in an encrypted file. Microsoft told you this themselves, on camera, in their own official video. And once you understand why, you'll never look at this company the same way again. It happened almost by accident, buried inside a Microsoft mechanics video meant to show off Azure's open source tools to developers. The presenter picks up a laptop, casually mentions it belongs to one of Microsoft's own cloud engineers, and says, without a flicker of hesitation, that thousands of employees inside the company now use Linux as their primary machine. Then, almost as if daring the internet not to notice, they open Microsoft Intune, the company's own device management platform, and show that Linux laptop fully enrolled, fully compliant, fully verified, sitting right alongside the Windows machines in the exact same security system. Think about what that actually means. This wasn't some rogue engineer running a hidden partition to avoid IT. This was Microsoft's own marketing department, the people paid to control every single frame of how this company presents itself to the world, deciding that showing a Linux laptop on official company video was completely fine. Not embarrassing, not something to cut, just normal. And that quiet normalcy is the real story here, because normal doesn't happen overnight. To understand how a company that once tried to legally strangle open source software ended, up here, you have to go back and follow a trail of decisions Microsoft made quietly, one after another, for over a decade. Each one small enough to escape headlines, but each one chipping away at the wall the company spent the 90s and early 2000s building around Windows. It starts in 2015, in a discovery almost nobody outside of tech. Journalism noticed at the time. Researchers digging into Microsoft's own data center hardware found something strange sitting deep inside Azure's networking backbone. The Azure Cloud Switch, custom-built hardware responsible for moving unimaginable amounts of traffic through Microsoft's own servers, wasn't running Windows at all. It was running a custom Linux kernel, built and maintained entirely in-house by Microsoft's own engineers somewhere. Inside the company, a team had looked at Windows, looked at the problem in front of them, and quietly concluded that their own operating system simply wasn't the right tool for the job. They didn't announce it. They didn't hold a press conference. They just built it, deployed it, and moved on, because the mission was never really about Windows. It was about whatever actually worked. That single decision, made in the shadows of Microsoft's own infrastructure, was the first crack in a wall that the public wouldn't even know existed for years. And once you start looking for it, you find that crack everywhere. Microsoft's Miracast wireless display devices, the ones that let you beam your screen onto a TV, have been running on Linux internally. Azure Sphere, Microsoft's own platform for securing internet-connected devices, was deliberately built on a Linux foundation because the engineers decided Linux's architecture was simply safer for that job than anything Windows could offer. Somewhere along the way, Microsoft even considered forking an entire outside Linux distribution, Fedora, to build their own private version under total company control, before ultimately deciding to work inside the existing open source community instead, playing by its rules, contributing code back, becoming a real citizen of a world they once tried to burn down. Every single one of these decisions tells you the same thing. Whenever Microsoft's engineers were handed a blank page and told to solve a hard problem the best way possible, with no brand loyalty attached, they kept reaching for Linux, not because marketing told them to, not because of some grand corporate rebrand, because it worked better. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story, because a public relations campaign can be reversed the moment it stops being convenient. But an engineering culture that has quietly, repeatedly, independently chosen a tool because it's genuinely superior is a signal that runs far deeper than any press release ever could. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because the numbers behind Azure explain exactly why this had to happen. According to Microsoft's own public disclosures, more than 2/3 of every processor core running customer workloads on Azure today is running Linux, not Windows Server. 2 out of every 3. On the cloud platform Microsoft itself built, Microsoft's own operating system is now the minority. And it isn't just customer workloads either. Microsoft 365, GitHub, and yes, even the infrastructure quietly humming beneath ChatGPT all rely on Linux somewhere. Underneath the surface, So think about the actual daily reality for a Microsoft cloud engineer in 2026. Their entire job, every single working hour, revolves around building, testing, and debugging Linux-based systems, wrestling with Linux command line tools, chasing down bugs inside Kubernetes clusters running on Linux hosts. Now ask yourself, if that's genuinely your entire job, does it make more sense to do that work through Windows, adding an extra translation layer, the same environment your code will actually live in? Microsoft's own engineers answered that question with their actions long before the company answered it publicly. And there's a name for this philosophy, one Microsoft has actually championed loudly for decades when it came to their own products: dogfooding, eating your own cooking. Microsoft has always demanded that internal teams run early, unfinished builds of Windows and Office on their own daily machines, specifically to catch problems before customers ever see them. So when you really think about it, letting cloud engineers run actual Linux machines to build actual Linux infrastructure isn't some radical betrayal of Microsoft's philosophy. It's the most consistent, logical extension of a rule the company already lived by. But before you picture rows of Microsoft desks covered in penguin stickers, here's the part almost nobody talks about, the part that keeps the story honest instead of turning it into a fantasy. Windows is still mandatory across the overwhelming majority of Microsoft's workforce, and nothing about this shift suggests that's about to change. Employees and former employees who've spoken about this online describe a company where Linux access is tightly restricted, granted almost exclusively to specific cloud and infrastructure engineering roles where there's a clear documented technical justification, while security policy, not personal preference, remains the deciding factor almost everywhere else. Someone working in sales, in HR, in marketing, or building traditional Windows software is still handed a Windows laptop. No exceptions, no debate. And there's a genuinely smart reason behind that restriction, one rooted in real security logic rather than lingering institutional stubbornness. Windows and Office source code represent some of the most valuable, most heavily protected intellectual property Microsoft owns, and the rules governing who can touch that code and how are understandably far stricter than the rules for engineers working on code that already lives out in the open on public GitHub repositories. An engineer building Azure Linux components is working with code the entire world can already see. An engineer touching core Windows source code is working with the company's crown jewels. Of course, those two people are going to be handed very different laptops under very different rules. This isn't hypocrisy. It's risk management, and understanding that distinction is exactly what separates a lazy headline from the real story. And speaking of the real story, there's a moment buried inside all of this that hits a human moment. Somewhere inside Microsoft, on a team that has nothing to do with Windows at all, a software engineer has spent his own personal time, outside of work, building an entire independent Linux distribution from scratch. It's called Anduin OS, built on top of Ubuntu, but deliberately carefully redesigned to look, feel, and behave almost exactly like Windows. The same taskbar rhythm, the same start menu instincts, even window snapping. Behavior that mirrors Windows' own beloved Fancy Zones feature. Reviewers who've tested it describe it as shockingly familiar, shockingly comfortable, built by someone who clearly understands, on a deeply personal level, exactly what makes people afraid to leave Windows behind. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This is a Microsoft engineer, quietly spending his own nights and weekends building a tool whose entire purpose is to make it easier for other people to walk away from the very product that pays his salary. Not out of rebellion, not out of some secret grudge, just because he clearly loves the craft of building good software more than he's attached to any particular logo on the box. Try to imagine that happening in 1998. Try to imagine any Microsoft employee back then even whispering enthusiasm for Linux in a hallway, let alone building a polished, publicly praised alternative in their spare time. It would have been unthinkable. And that gap between what was unthinkable then and what's completely unremarkable now is the entire emotional core of this story. It doesn't stop with one engineer's side project either. Microsoft now has employees publicly, individually credited for contributing real engineering work back into the open source Linux ecosystem. One Microsoft Linux engineer recently co-authored a technical proposal aimed at improving how packages are built for Fedora, work directly tied to performance improvements for Azure Linux, Microsoft's own first-party Linux distribution. This is a named Microsoft employee, publicly recognized by the open source community for making Linux itself better, not repackaging it, not consuming it for free and giving nothing back, but genuinely contributing to the thing Microsoft once tried to destroy. And it's not an isolated case. Microsoft has quietly become one of the largest corporate financial backers of the Linux Foundation, the nonprofit that funds and coordinates development of the Linux kernel itself, and the company routinely sends engineers to open source conferences to contribute code, documentation, and expertise the entire industry benefits from. That kind of sustained, expensive, long-term participation is nearly impossible to fake for a decade. A single flashy announcement can be corporate theater. A 10-year pattern of quiet financial and engineering investment is something else entirely. Now, skeptics, and there are plenty of them, people who watched Microsoft's earlier war on Linux up close and never quite trusted the ceasefire, will tell you this entire transformation traces back to cold, simple self-interest, rather than any deep philosophical awakening at the top of the company. And honestly, they're not wrong. Azure's continued success depends heavily on deep Linux expertise across Microsoft's own workforce, and cultivating that expertise, including through company-issued Linux hardware, is a rational, calculated business decision, not a poetic redemption arc. But here's the twist that makes this story land even harder. It doesn't actually matter which explanation you believe, whether you think this is genuine cultural transformation or pure commercial necessity. The underlying reality on the ground is identical either way. The laptops are real, the Intune enrollment is real, the open source contributions are real. The engineer building Anduin OS on his own time is real. You can debate Microsoft's motives all day long, but you can't debate the evidence sitting right there on Microsoft's own promotional video. And this pattern isn't slowing down. If anything, it's about to accelerate hard. Brendan Burns, the corporate vice president overseeing Azure's open source and cloud-native strategy, has said publicly that Linux and Kubernetes together are the essential foundation making products like ChatGPT function at massive scale. Microsoft's own 2026 developer conference presentations leaned even further into this, framing Linux-based infrastructure as absolutely central to the company's entire artificial intelligence strategy going forward, not some tolerated side path for customers who happen to prefer it. Which means the engineers building Microsoft's AI infrastructure right now, arguably the single most important technical priority inside the entire company, need real, hands-on, daily fluency with Linux systems just to do their jobs. Company-issued Linux laptops for that group aren't some quirky exception anymore. They're simply what the job requires. And that's really the lesson sitting underneath this entire story, one that stretches far beyond Microsoft and far beyond operating systems. Corporate culture, just like the technology stack underneath it, eventually bends to match operational reality, even when that bend directly contradicts the image a company spent decades building in public. Microsoft spent years loudly defending Windows as the unshakable center of its universe, while quietly, behind closed doors, its own engineering culture had already started drifting somewhere else entirely, years before the public ever found out. That gap between the polished public story and the messier internal truth is worth watching for everywhere in this industry, not just here. And what makes this particular chapter so hard to look away from is that it shows absolutely no sign of reversing. Every signal, the AI infrastructure investment, the growing Azure Linux distribution, the deepening open source contributions, points in exactly the same direction, further and further away from the old Windows-only orthodoxy that once defined this company to its core. The company that once compared an entire operating system to a disease now builds official device management pathways specifically so its own employees can use that operating system every single day, fully supported, fully sanctioned, fully embedded into the machinery of the very company that once tried to kill it. Not as a secret, not as a rebellion, as standard equipment. And somewhere inside that quiet, almost boring bureaucratic detail, a laptop, an enrollment screen, a compliance checkmark, is one of the most genuinely remarkable reversals in modern tech history, hiding in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone to actually notice.